Hey, so welcome to another podcast episode of the Soulful Side of Life with me, Portee. I hope that you are well and having a good week. I am excited about this podcast interview with Kevin Frost. Kevin is a calm, gentle man, and I have known Kevin for the past 2-3 years now, attending amfAR's events. amfAR is the AIDS research organization that has raised a lot of money for HIV and AIDS research and funding programs and initiatives around the world. And amfAR has a special place in my heart. I had a cousin who died of AIDS, and the work that the organization that they do is very important. And I was able to pick Kevin's brain and hear about his journey from growing up as a military brat and briefly living in Buffalo, New York, and how he got from that to being CEO of amfAR, and he is 6 weeks retired. He shared, and he's passed the baton along to someone else, and he is now enjoying a retirement life. But I was inspired by the conversation with Kevin, and he did the sweetest thing after the interview. The musician that he is, he played a lovely song on the piano for me, and he sang a Willie Nelson tune with his guitar. And we discovered we have a love of country music. So just a little bit about Kevin. Kevin joined amfAR in 1994, and he served in various roles before being appointed CEO. As Vice President of Clinical Research and Prevention Programs, and later Vice President of Global Initiatives, he worked extensively in Asia, facilitating the development of amfAR's Treat Asia program, which he talks a little bit about in the interview. During his time as CEO, Kevin oversaw the launch of major initiatives, including amfAR Institute for HIV Cure Research, established in 2016 with a 5-year, $20 million grant to the University of California, San Francisco. So enjoy this interview with Kevin, be inspired, and remember the importance of caring and having a soft spot in your heart for people who have HIV and AIDS. A lot of people are born with this disease. A lot of people get it from drug use, and some people get it through sex. But no matter how you get it, we are all God's creation, and God loves all of us, and we don't know people's stories and what led them to get any disease that someone may have. Let us not sit in judgments, but rather in love of everyone. So enjoy this podcast episode. So Kevin, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Allie. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Indeed. You've got a fascinating life, and I want to ask you some questions about it. So the first question is, you spent some time living in Buffalo, and actually my grandmother lived there and some great aunts. I'm curious, did you enjoy living there?
I was quite young when we lived there, but my mother and father were both from Buffalo, New York. They both grew up in Buffalo. My ancestors, go back several generations in the Buffalo area. My family, the Frost family, and my mother's family, which her maiden name was Salisbury, but the Frost family goes back a very long way here in America. We were part of one of the earliest families to settle on the North Shore of Long Island in Oyster Bay. And somewhere around the mid-1700s, the family emigrated north up to Lake Ontario. and they were farmers in a small town called Barker, which is about an hour outside of Buffalo. And then eventually my great-grandfather moved to Buffalo, which is where my grandfather and my father both grew up. And my mother grew up in Buffalo. Her family was from that area. She lived on what was called the towpath. She lived along the Niagara River in a settlement of Irish, and had lived in a house with no running water and no electricity that my great-great-grandfather, Patrick Mannion, built. And so my father was in the military. So we moved around a lot when I was young. And in the early 1970s, he went to Vietnam. And so while he was serving for a year in Vietnam, my mother took the family back to Buffalo just so we could be around aunts and uncles. And, I come from a pretty large family. I have a lot of brothers and sisters, and she wanted family help. And so we lived there for about a year when I was 10 years old. And then after my father came back from Vietnam, we moved to Texas. But I only spent that 1 year in Buffalo. I have wonderful pictures of my father and my mother growing up in Buffalo. And we didn't actually live in Buffalo. We lived in Niagara Falls while which
Oh,
is just, outside of Buffalo, while my father was in Vietnam. And that was really the only time I spent there. Years ago, when my mom was still alive, we went to Buffalo together because I was doing a whole, as you can probably tell, a very lengthy family history project for my family. And I wanted to see the places where they grew up and where they went to high school and all of that. And so we spent about a week together in Buffalo, just looking at the house where my dad grew up and the towpath, which is now long gone because there's a highway. But my mom showed me all of the areas where she grew up and everything. It was a lot of fun.
how cool. The Niagara Falls area and going to the falls is very nice. So,
It is beautiful.
yeah, I don't think I could live there. It's too cold, too much snow, but it is nice to visit.
Remind me where you are, Allie.
In Columbia, South Carolina.
Okay, well, you can probably see from behind me that we're still very much in a winter wonderland here in Connecticut.
Yeah, I could see that, and I was just outside, and it's quite warm here today. It must be
Oh,
almost 70, so,
oh.
I won't trade you.
No, I think we're going to reach a high of 36 today. So I think you
Yeah,
definitely have us beat.
yeah, for sure. Um, you were an opera singer. What was that like?
Well, what was it like? I loved music. My undergraduate degree from university is in music. I had designs, it's true, on being an opera singer. But the kind of opera singer I'm a lyric tenor.
Mhm.
And if I turned my computer around, you would see my piano and everything here in the living room where I still play and practice and do all of that. Um, but lyric tenors, when it comes to opera, don't really come into their voice until about the time they're in their mid 30s, maybe even a little later, like late 30s. And so I moved to New York in 1990, February of 1990. And I was 27 years old at the time. And I thought, well, I'm going to, continue to pursue a career in music. I was doing a lot of musical theater and things like that at the time. I guess you could kind of say waiting for my voice to come in. But it's like that old John Lennon song, that line that says, life is what happens to you when you're making other plans.
Mm.
Um, I got to New York in 1990, which was really the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And my life went in a different direction. It took on a life of its own, if you will. I loved opera. I still love opera. I go to the opera regularly. I still sing opera when I'm here in my living room. But I guess there were just different plans for me that didn't include pursuing that path. And I certainly have no regrets about it. It's a very difficult life, one that depends on being healthy all the time and all kinds of other things. But I think that my study of the opera was incredibly enriching for me personally. It allowed me to study languages and to learn the language of music. And I have a love for the great composers. So it's part of my life that I cherish very much.
Yeah, my mom's an elementary school music teacher, and she, like you,
Oh.
majored in music. And I grew up hearing about all of the amazing composers. What's your favorite composer? Or who is your favorite composer? What's your favorite opera?
Okay, so those are both unfair questions in my world. Very difficult questions to answer. People often ask me, what is my favorite opera? And what I usually say to them is I don't have a favorite opera. I have 5 favorite opera composers whose music
Mm,
I come back to most, right? Um, Puccini and Verdi, of course, are 2 of them. Mozart is definitely one. Wagner is probably the 4th. And then the 5th is kind of a toss up between some lesser known Italian composers. But if I could only have one and I could only listen to their music among the other 4, it would probably be Bellini, who
okay.
wrote wonderful Italian lyrical operas like I Puritani, La Sonnambula, some beautiful, beautiful works that I love. But very close behind are Rossini and Donizetti.
Do you think that you'll pursue opera on the stage now that you're retired?
I'm too old. I'm past my
Um,
prime. Those days have come and gone for me. Instead, I have found musical outlet through cabaret. And years ago, right before COVID hit, I did a cabaret show in New York at a club called the Duplex, and I did a one night only sold out benefit for amfAR, actually. And so when I sit down to play the piano here in the living room, as I often do, a lot of the music that I play is that. It's cabaret music and Broadway show tunes. Like those are kind of my staple these days. And I find I can still sort of sing those things without it being too difficult.
Okay. Well, I think that's inspiring. I mean, I love music and being able to go to live performances and seeing that kind of art be produced. It's amazing, the
Well,
voices
maybe
that
when
some
we
people.
finish up here, I'll play something for you.
Oh, I would love that. I would love it. I played well, I learned a little piano growing up, but I have the biggest trouble with the bass clef notes. For some
Ah,
reason, it's so hard for me to read them. I played violin in middle school, which they're treble clef notes, so I don't have any
yeah.
problem with that. And I've begun to think, maybe I should pick up the violin again because I just struggle with the piano. I have to write the
Well,
notes in.
I think it's like learning any language. I tell people this all the time. Music is just a language, right?
Mm,
And
mhm.
I don't know if you've studied any foreign languages, but if you've studied any of the Romance languages like Italian, French, Spanish, Romanian, conjugating French verbs is, uh, quite the challenge for non-native speakers. And when you're learning the difference between a masculine noun and a feminine noun and all of these different rules that sort of go into it, there's no real substitute for just time and practice, right? The more
Yeah.
time you spend with the language, the more you practice the language, the more you learn it, the more it comes together. And I think music is the same way. The more time you spend with music, the more time you spend learning whatever your instrument may be, whether it's violin or piano or guitar, um, the more natural it comes. It just becomes ingrained as you speak that language. So I'm not surprised, that you might be surprised to learn that there's more than just the bass and treble clef. There are other clefs as well. So when
Yeah.
you're looking at an orchestral score, as opera singers do, you're reading in multiple clefs at the same time to understand what the orchestra is doing. So it can be quite challenging.
It is another language when looking at as you said, the orchestral score, and seeing a composer and he's conducting and he's looking at the music. He knows what he's reading, and I'm like, I don't."
Yeah, no, me neither. I'm always envious of these conductors and composers, frankly, who could look
Yeah.
at an orchestral score with 30 parts and actually hear it in their head, like hear the orchestra in their head. That was never me. I could never master that. I was never that advanced, but certainly it's a skill that I'm envious of.
It's a calling for sure. Um, so I'm curious, how does and you kind of got into this a little bit already, but how does a guy from, you're a military brat, go and then your music pursuing of music get to become CEO of amfAR?
Well, that's kind of a long story. And, I won't lie because I think serendipity plays a big part of that, just sheer luck and being in the right place at the right time, I guess. I, um, I was the first job I ever got when I moved to New York City was working in a record store called Tower Records, which was famous. Tower Records was down on East 4th Street in Broadway, and it was a famous record chain that had started on the West Coast and moved to the East Coast, and there are now documentaries on Netflix about Tower Records. But I worked in the classical music department upstairs, and I was always sort of a socially aware person. I was always sort of, following politics and what was happening in the world well outside of my world of music, right? And one night when I was working in Tower Records, not long after I'd gotten to New York, a guy named Larry Kramer walked in. Larry Kramer was a very famous, well-known playwright and activist in New York who had started a group called ACT UP, which was an activist group that was working to try to impact the AIDS epidemic. Because as I said earlier, this was the height of the AIDS epidemic. And I knew Larry's work. In fact, I had seen his play, The Normal Heart, when I was still living in Texas, and it really moved me. I mean, it was really impactful. And so Larry walked in, and I'd never met Larry before that night, and I recognized him right away. And so I went over to him and I asked him if I could help him find something, and he was looking for an opera recording because Larry was also a big lover of the opera. We started looking for that, and at some point along the way, I said to him, I just want you to know that I saw your play, The Normal Heart, and it really moved me. And he said to me, well, if it moved you so much, what are you doing about it? Although he used much harsher language than that. And of course, me being this gentle Southern kid from Texas, I was a little taken aback by his abruptness. But I think he saw that right away. And of course, he softened because Larry was actually a teddy bear underneath. He said to me, listen, if you really were moved by my play, there's a group of us that get together on Monday nights over at the Gay and Lesbian Center on 13th Street. Maybe you could come and help. And so the next Monday night, I went to my first ACT UP meeting and I became an AIDS activist. And I got more and more involved with the organization. And the next summer, while I was still working at Tower, a young woman came to work there who was a college student, and she was home on her summer break. And we became fast friends. Her name was Abby Friedberg. We became really tight. Abby and I were good friends, and we worked together a lot, and we laughed a lot. And one day when we were working together, she said to me, my mom is a doctor and a researcher at NYU, and she's starting a research program on HIV/AIDS. And she's looking for somebody just to come over and be a part-time help for her in setting up the program. Are you interested? And I said, yeah, of course I'm interested. That would be great. And so she set me up with an interview with her mom, who was Dorothy Friedberg. And Dorothy's still alive today. I saw her about 2 weeks ago in New York City. She's 83 years old. Wow. And Dorothy hired me to work for her at NYU. And I spent about the better part of 2.5, almost 3 years working for Dorothy. And I started out part-time. Eventually, she hired me full-time. So I was able to quit my job at Tower Records. I was also working part-time at the Metropolitan Opera, and I was able to quit that job. And so I went to work for Dorothy full-time. And this is how, we talk about life happening when you're making other plans. I didn't plan to work for Dorothy full-time. It just kind of happened. And then through my work with Dorothy, I met a physician because NYU Medical Center has a teaching arrangement with Bellevue Hospital, which is the big public hospital in New York. And I met a physician at Bellevue who was head of the AIDS program. He was director of AIDS program at Bellevue Hospital, a man named Charles Farthing. And Dr. Farthing and I became friends, and we were very close. And at some point, Dr. Farthing started to recruit me. He wanted me to come to work at Bellevue. And eventually he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And so I left Dorothy's program at NYU and went to work at Bellevue, even though I didn't even have to change buildings. And I became the AIDS inpatient care coordinator for Bellevue Hospital in New York City. And Charles, who had recruited me, after about 6 months, said to me, I have to tell you that I'm leaving. And I'm going to Los Angeles to become the new medical director for the AIDS Healthcare Foundation in LA. And this was very early on in 1994. And so at that point, with Charles leaving, I wasn't sure that I wanted to stay at Bellevue because, he was the one who had recruited me. So I started looking around, and it turned out that there was a woman whom I knew, another physician named Dr. Ellen Cooper, who was head of the antiviral division at FDA. And she had left the FDA. She'd gone to work for a couple of drug companies. And then it had just been announced in early 1994 that she had joined amfAR, the Foundation for AIDS Research, or as it was known then, the American Foundation for AIDS Research. And Ellen was living and working. amfAR had an office down in Rockville, Maryland, near the FDA, and that was their clinical research office. I reached out to Ellen. I sent her a letter and said, I understand you've gone to work at amfAR. If you ever need help in your research program, I'd love to be considered. Well, I got a response from her right away, and she asked me to come interview. And so I did. I went and interviewed with her, and she hired me, and I was a administrative assistant in the Rockville, Maryland office for amfAR. So I left New York City and I moved to Washington. I was living in Washington's DuPont Circle, and spent a year working in that
I went to
office.
school there. How cool.
Oh, really? Where'd you go to
Yeah.
school?
George Washington University.
Oh, very, very, very cool. Yeah. So I was there in DuPont Circle for about a year, from September of 94 till September of 95, and then amfAR asked me to come back to their New York office. The CEO at the time was a man named Jerry Radwin. He asked me to come back. And so I did. And so from 1995 until 2025, I was working in New York for amfAR, not that office, but a couple of offices in New York. How did I become CEO? Well, I don't really know. Other than I liked the work very much. I felt like I was making a difference. I was able to contribute in a way that was meaningful. And for some really unbeknownst reason, amfAR just kept promoting me and giving me more and more responsibility until the mid 2000s, I guess, or the early 2000s, really, when I became vice president for global programs at amfAR. And at that point, in 2001, 2002, I moved to Bangkok, Thailand, and created an office there for research on HIV/AIDS in Asia. And I set up that program. I spent about 5 years living there until 2007, which is when the board of trustees at amfAR asked me to return to New York to become amfAR's CEO. And I think they gave me the job because they had conducted a year-long search for a CEO. They couldn't find anybody they liked. And so I was still hanging around at that point, and they're like, well, let's give this guy a shot. And so they asked me to become CEO.
That's cool. I mean, you don't get to become CEO usually unless people see good, strong leadership qualities in you. So I'm sure that it was meant to be.
Well, that's kind of you to say. Thank you.
What is something we may not realize about the AIDS epidemic in Asia?
I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize how young the epidemic is in Asia. And I mean that really in two ways, because it was one of the things that really struck me when I was traveling in the region. This would have been the late 1990s and the early 2000s. I traveled to countries that had growing epidemics like Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, places like that. And I would meet with these organizations, and I would go to these hospitals, and I would talk to people about the epidemic there. And I was really, really sort of disconcerted by how young the epidemic was, meaning I was meeting people, young women, young girls, and young boys, young men who were HIV positive and were sometimes 13, 14, 15 years old. And they were
Mm.
becoming infected with HIV. And in different places, it was often for different reasons. In Indonesia and in Vietnam, the primary driver of the epidemic at that time was injection drug use, like needles. And I was struck by how widespread injection drug use was among young people. I mean, I met a young girl in Jakarta in Indonesia who told me her story of how she started injecting drugs when she was 12 years old. Like she was
Mm.
introduced to needles when she was 12 and started injecting. And, the epidemic in many ways in Asia remains an epidemic among young people, right?
Mm.
Now, there are different ways in which the epidemic is spread, sometimes through injection drug use, sometimes through, sex. And yet, invariably, it is the very young in these countries who are often the ones living with HIV. And that was a big surprise to me. And I think it continues to be a surprise to a lot of people, just how young people are.
Sure, when they're like babies, kind of.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, I think that when many people think about amfAR, they think about the big galas, but I like
Mm.
this quote by Jake Gyllenhaal, who attended a Cannes gala one year, and he said, "Attention on celebrity is fine, but attention on causes that need attention is way more important," meaning in that case, AIDS, it's a very important cause that needs attention. Why is it important that people not get glossy-eyed over amfAR celebrity drawn events and keep focus on the research and cure for AIDS?
You know, for us, for amfAR, celebrity was a means to an ends, right? If having celebrities at an event would get people inside the event,
Mm.
then that was an opportunity for me to talk to them about the research. And let's face it, we're living in a celebrity-driven world these days, right? We are living in a world in which celebrity drives so many things. And frankly, when celebrities would come to amfAR events, people wanted to be at those events. So they would buy tickets and they would show up and they would come. And if I got them inside, then I had an opportunity to convince them about the cause. If I didn't have them inside, the event, there was nobody to talk to. So celebrities were really just a means to an end. And in some ways, I think, Elizabeth Taylor really pioneered that. She really understood that, being a celebrity gave her a platform to talk about the things that she cared about. And she used that platform for good, recognizing that, I can do this. I can be, a celebrity, but I can also use that platform to advance these causes that I care about. And so, we were able to capitalize on that. I think it's changed a lot. I will say it's different today than it once was. But, in those early years with Elizabeth and even Sharon Stone to an extent when she was really our primary ambassador, we were able to get people to come to our celebrities, to come to our events on behalf of the cause, knowing that they were using their platform for something good. I mean, I think in many ways, Elton John kind of embodies that today, right? The Elton John AIDS Foundation is able to convince celebrities to come because they have Elton, and Elton can make those asks and people will come because it's Elton. But I think the formula has changed significantly since those early days, and it's a lot harder today.
Sure. Yeah, I guess celebrities really do help bring in, uh, people. Without them, it would be harder. So it's
Yeah.
a blessing for, both sides that they can use their platform for good, and yeah. I'm curious, when in the '90s, early '90s, when you were in New York, were you there when Princess Diana made that big visit, and did you get to meet her?
I never met Princess Diana, and I don't remember what year she visited New York.
Yeah.
But in my time as an activist, I don't remember her coming to New York, and I wonder if maybe she came before I got to New York. I'm not sure. I don't remember when she made that visit.
Yeah, it was in the early '90s sometime, and I can't
Oh,
remember if it was AIDS focused, or I know that she also visited, like a children's hospital or something in a poor area. But, yeah, I was just curious if you had met her, because her being a royal celebrity made an impact. I think when most people think about AIDS, especially in the '90s, we think of Princess Diana touching people,
oh
and
yeah.
breaking that stigma. Um,
There
yeah,
are famous pictures of her touching, um, reaching out to shake hands with people living with AIDS in hospital wards.
yeah,
And those photos, of course, made a huge difference, an enormous difference in changing people's perception,
yeah.
about, um, so I looked it up on ChatGPT while we were chatting. It says that her first official solo visit to New York was in February of 1989,
Oh,
and she visited Harlem Hospital to open the city's first pediatric AIDS unit, a significant moment in reducing HIV/AIDS. So that would have been a year before I got to New York that she
okay,
was there. She came to New York a couple of more times in '95 to attend the Met Gala, and then about 2 months before her death in '97, she came for a Christie's charity auction, which raised over $3 million.
right. Right,
Yeah,
I see. You probably would have met her then if you had been there in '89. I thought it was the
maybe.
'90s, early '90s,
Yeah,
when she did
maybe.
that visit. Yeah. Um, I first came or got an understanding of AIDS, I must have been about 8 or so, when my dad's, first cousin, she died, of AIDS, and, her husband had given it to her, and, I didn't realize in the times visiting her before she died that she was sick with anything. I thought she was just naturally thin. Um, I think it can be so easy for people to judge people with HIV and AIDS, thinking that they were reckless in some way. But what's something that we need to keep in mind about before making judgments on people about people who have this disease?
I always try to remind people that it's just a virus, right? It's this organism, right? And
Mhm.
there are lots of viruses that circulate in our population. And ultimately, I don't believe in the kind of judgment, that people sometimes pass because they believe that certain behaviors don't conform to you know, their lifestyle or their belief systems, whatever that may be. I remember once I was speaking at a conference, an AIDS conference, in Bangkok, and I was speaking to a room full of Asian investigators. There were probably 300 investigators or so in the room, and a member of the audience. We were in the Q&A section, and they were allowed to ask questions. And a member of the audience stood up and said, "What do you say to people who believe that AIDS is God's punishment
Mm.
on gay people for their sin and for their lifestyle?" And I thought about it for a moment, and I said, well, a couple of things. First, if that's true, how do you explain AIDS in babies, newborn babies? And if that's true, how do you explain the fact that more heterosexuals in the world were living with HIV than gay people were? Because, of course, when you took Africa and South America and Asia and places like that into account, there were far more heterosexuals living with HIV/AIDS than there were gay people. I said, but I think there's a more important lesson here. You ask, what do you say to people who believe AIDS is God's punishment? I say to those people that what if AIDS is God's challenge to people of faith? Keep in mind, that the Bible teaches that Jesus went and tended to the lepers, to the sick. And Jesus taught that we should take care of the least of those among us, those who need us the most. So what if, in fact, AIDS isn't God's punishment, but God's challenge to people of faith to see how you respond? Do you think God will look favorably upon those who stood in judgment and refused to help, or those who, without judgment, went in to help those people? That's a question for people of faith.
Yeah, for sure, because there's many different reasons of why people get diseases, and when it comes to something like HIV and AIDS, it doesn't always mean, as you just pointed out, that it comes from sex. There's many different ways to get it, and remembering the mission of Christ was to be there and not cast judgment on people, but to love people.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
is most important.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah,
Exactly.
I've also, though, seen gay people in a slight way judge people with HIV and AIDS. So I think, and what I mean by that is having conversations saying, oh, well, it's great the work that AIDS organizations do, but there's a recklessness that people have lived with their lifestyle. But it's the same with heterosexual people. There's a recklessness that people can live, so you can't just paint
Yeah,
broad
I mean,
strokes.
look, at judgment, you know, judgment comes from all kinds of people in all walks of life. And, I just think that we are better off in a judgment-free world in which, as you say, we love each other.
Indeed. Indeed. So President Obama appointed you to the Presidential Advisory Committee on HIV and AIDS. What was that task like, and what was it like working with him?
Well, I think when I look back on that time that that Presidential Advisory Council was probably one of the most disappointing times, in my career in terms of the work that I did. I was profoundly disappointed in the Presidential Advisory Council, what it did and what it was, in my view, not able to accomplish during its time.
Mm.
Uh, and, I had never been part of a Washington or a political sort of appointee group prior to that. I didn't really know what to expect. But what I came to learn very quickly was that very often these councils are created in order to create the appearance of work getting done without really any of the sort of authority or even influence to get work done. Um, and so, the council spent a lot of time drafting resolutions and putting forth plans and coming up with recommendations and stuff, none of which, as far as I could tell, ever really made any kind of a meaningful impact upon Washington or the decision makers there. amfAR's policy office in Washington, D.C. was 100 times more effective at advancing public policy in Washington than the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. It really was more of an honorific, a figure group, in my view, and one that was not designed to really make an impact. So for me, it wasn't a great experience. I'm sure other people had better experiences than I did, but I didn't particularly love that experience.
I guess feedback for presidents is when these advisory councils are created, uh, try and make the effort to do something meaningful out of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. But politics is one thing, and the real world is something else, as I came to learn.
true. Did you find Bush's PEPFAR to be beneficial to the AIDS space?
Oh, nothing impacted the global epidemic more than PEPFAR. PEPFAR was the single greatest American achievement in the global fight against HIV/AIDS. PEPFAR was a winning program from start to end and saved so many millions of lives in ways that changed the trajectory of the epidemic. I think, that single program, when the history book on HIV/AIDS is written, that single program is likely to be held up as the single greatest public health achievement that the United States ever did.
Oh. And it's a shame, I think it got overshadowed by 9/11. I think Bush had so many more plans in Africa and to do work with, AIDS, but 9/11 happened.
Yeah, I think, obviously 9/11 changed so many things about our world, but that was certainly one of them. And mind you, PEPFAR still went on to do great things, right? PEPFAR was
Yeah.
doing really extraordinary work around the world. Um, but I think that yes, if we had not had 9/11, it might have actually completely ended the AIDS epidemic as we know it.
Yeah, which hopefully that's on the horizon soon. A couple of last questions. When you look back over your life from being a research assistant at NYU Medical Center and working at Bellevue Hospital, your roles at amfAR, you've had this incredible journey in HIV and AIDS. Would you say life unfolds as it should? As one stays humble and hungry and ambitious because you had this plan to go into music, but life didn't unfold that way, and that happens for a lot of us. We study one thing and work in something completely different, so when you look at life and calling, would you say it typically unfolds as it should?
Yeah, I mean, there's a Persian philosopher who asked the question, how can a man run away from what's written? How can you escape your destiny? Um, yeah, at the end of the day, I think that, at least for me, life has happened in the way that it was supposed to. I'm doing
Mm,
and did exactly what I was supposed to be doing. And I have absolutely no regrets about the path I took. Um, I'm sure you're familiar with Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken.
yeah,
And I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And so, yeah, I feel like this has happened the way it was supposed to happen.
yeah. Um, now that you're in retirement, how are you spending your days?
Well, I'm only I'm only about 6 weeks into retirement. So maybe if you asked me in 6 months, the answer would be different. But I'm first of all, there's a ton of work to do to just sort of clean up all of the things that needed to be completed and paperwork and financial things and things like that. Um, I program my days. I'm conscious about wanting to be productive and how I plan my days. So I set aside sort of what I've been doing so far is set aside blocks of time, right? And because we're in the winter months here and because it's been a particularly brutally cold winter, we've been inside most of the time. I think you know that I have twin boys who are
Yes.
12 years old. So take them to school every morning, pick them from school up every afternoon. Sometimes they have other activities like soccer and stuff like that. So that's part of the day. But I also, like when I was talking about programming my day, so I try to set aside an hour every day for reading. which is not something I really was doing much when I was working because I was so on the go and I was so run all the time that I didn't get a chance to read as much as I wanted to. And I have bookshelves of books upstairs that I bought over the years, but never got a chance to sit down and read. So I've started reading. I study French. I try to study French for at least an hour every day because towards the end of the summer, early fall of this year, I'm moving the entire family to France. Um, and the boys are going to study abroad at least for a couple of years in France and see how they like it. So I'm brushing up on my French. There's a lot of work to be done to apply for French visas. I spend a lot of time on that. I devote, an hour at least, or try to devote time every day to my music, whether that's playing the piano or playing the guitar or whatever I might be doing, listening to an opera. I have a music library here in the house where I keep all my musical scores and things. So I might sit down and study a musical score for an hour just to, learn it more in depth. So I find that it's quite interesting. It's not what I expected. I expected that once I was retired that my days would be long. In fact, I'm always surprised when, my husband might say to me, "Hey, we got to go pick up the boys." Like the day is gone before I even know it. And so it's quite full. And I think that will increase even more once the summer months hit and things start to warm up and I can be outside more and doing more outdoor activities, which I love. So my days are quite full. I'm quite
Yeah.
pleased.
A new phase of life.
A new phase
uh,
of life.
Last question. I'm 37. What would you tell your 37-year-old self?
Wow. Well, at 37, I was only just beginning to come into sort of my work in its most robust form at amfAR. But the thing my mind goes to now, because I'm 63, that I would have thought about more at 37 is I would have tried to save more money. Because naturally, when you become a retiree, you now are living on a different kind of, income, whatever you've saved, whatever your retirement income might be. And I'm fortunate, don't get me wrong, I've done very well, but I certainly didn't think about that when I was 37. I moved to New York City when I was 27 and I didn't have a penny to my name. I mean, I was poor as a church mouse. And, I was working part-time at a record store making, I don't know, $8 an hour or whatever it was that I was making at the time, maybe less than that even. And I worked all these different jobs until I got hired at NYU and eventually Bellevue. But I didn't actually own anything or buy anything of any significance because I didn't have any money.
Mhm.
Even at the age of 37, I just didn't have, a lot of money. And as I look back on it now, I think I would have told myself to save more money,
Mhm.
to just be better prepared for that day when retirement does come.
Yeah. I heard Michelle Obama in a podcast with Emma Grady say that it wasn't until they left the White House that she could buy her mom a condo with a doorman, that it took that long.
Right?
People may think that they had all this money, even before the White House, but they didn't, and it really
Mm-mm,
does take time to
it
get to
does.
that level where you can be a blessing to other or your family and live
Yeah.
comfortably.
Well, and going not just with the sort of saving money and earning money is the investing money, right? Because I don't know anything, even to this day, I really don't know anything about finance, but I would have tried to invest more when I was younger.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure, Allie.
For me as well, learning about your music life and musical tastes and your journey with amfAR. It's been inspiring for me.
Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed this podcast episode and that you have found a soulful connection to the conversation. God bless you, and until the next episode, go bless somebody else.